You spent hours dialing in your quad cortex or your Helix at home. It sounds killer, but then you take it to the gig and it gets lost in the mix, or it's rattling the walls, or even worse, it just sounds like pure mud. If that sounds familiar to you, then the problem isn't your playing, it's most likely the IR settings or the cabinet settings in your quad cortex or your Helix. In this video, I'm going to show you 3 simple proven cab tips that'll make your tone cut through the mix, sound great at home, and also keep your sound tech happy every single gig. Hey, I'm Twisty, and in this video, I'm going to talk about live bass tone secrets with the Helix and the HX Stomp. These secrets will probably work with your Cortex or your ToneMaster Pro, and they'll also work with real amps and cabs if you're unfortunate enough not to own a Helix. Now, whether you're sending your signal directly to front of house or playing through a real cab on stage or using in-ear monitors, your cab setters matter more than you think they do. Stick around to the end of the video because I'm going to show you how I dial in my cab blocks using low cuts, mic selection, and a stage volume trick that works every time. Let's have a look. Let's be honest, most of us build our presets at home, in the bedroom or the lounge room, very rarely in a studio, and most unlikely in a live setting. We often use monitors or a low volume practice amp, or most likely headphones. Still haven't got around to replacing those yet. But then you get to the stage in front of a live audience and it's a boomy low end, or you're buried in the mix, or you're so bright that it pierces through the crowd, but not in a good way. The main culprit is likely to be your cab block setup. It isn't tuned for the real world, and especially at gig volumes. One of the benefits of using cabs instead of IRs on your Helix is you get amazing tools to configure the output, but only if you use them with intention, not haphazardly and hoping for the best. So let's fix that. Let me walk you through my 3 pillars of live cab tone success. The first one is tone shaping with high and low cuts. The Line 6 Helix allows you to EQ your cab blocks at the cab level, which is a game changer. One of the advantages of using the Line 6 cab sims instead of an IR is that you get a number of controls to adjust the tone and the performance of the cab that you don't get with the IRs. So the general rule I work to is that you add a low cut filter between 50 and 60 Hertz. This cuts out the sub rumble and stage boom, and especially useful if you're using PA subwoofers. So if you're in a live gig and they've got big subs, sometimes that lower than 60 Hertz makes that rumble that just won't go away or interferes with the rest of the band. Now, as a rule of thumb, I usually set it to 45 Hertz because that gives me a little bit of bottom end, but it keeps me out of the kick drums range. So I roll off that real sub lows, but I keep enough in there to make the tone deep enough, and I'm also out of the kick. My recommendations for high cut filtering is around 5.5 to 6.5 kilohertz. This tames the harsh top end from your tweeters and also keeps your tone round and warm. One of the things I like to do is the cabinet that I'm modeling, I like to look up the frequency ranges for that from the website, and you'll find that most of those cab sims in the Helix all start to roll off around about 5 kilohertz. So I personally set my high cut at around 5 kilohertz, and that gets rid of that high end noise. So what I'm doing is I'm cutting the spectrum of sound down so that the bottom end's not being subby and the high end's not being tweetery, and it's a nice, warm, contained tone. When you're using a real cab and amp, you might want to invest in an EQ that has low and high pass filters in it. If you've got a DI pedal that has an EQ in it, then that's perfect. You can then put those low cuts and high passes at that point. If you don't, and the engineer is either miking you or using a random DI pedal, then my recommendation is to advise the engineer to roll those off at the desk. Why these low and high cuts matters is that live stages amplify everything. So what sounds fat at home can turn into mud at gig volume. The second pillar is around the mic choice and placement in the cab block. Different mics have different mix presence. Dynamic mics like the 421 or the SM57 have balanced mids and they're great for punchy rock. Mics like the Beta 52, which are often used for kick drum miking, have a big low end, but they need an EQ to avoid going muddy. Ribbon mics have a smooth high and are great for a vintage tone. So if you're sort of playing more of a jazz bar-y environment, then a ribbon mic might give you that tone you're looking for. Condenser mics, on the other hand, are very hi-fi. They're very detailed and they can be a bit bright when you're playing live. So think of the genre of music you're trying to play, the tone you're trying to get out of that, and think then about the average room that you're going to be playing in live. If you're playing small to medium club venues at a reasonably loud front of house mix, then something like a dynamic mic might be perfect all-rounder for you. And the 421 might give you enough of the warmth to round out the loss of that low end that you've taken out with the low cut. When you're looking at placing the mic on the cabinet, and this goes for the real amps and cabs as well, you want to look at placing the mic around 1 to 2 inches from the grill. My preference is right up against the grill, or the closest you can get with the Helix settings. The further you move the mic, the more room tone you're going to get. Now this sounds great in your bedroom, which is fairly, or in your headphones where you're looking at a bit of reverb or ambience. But when you're playing in a live venue, the more of that you add, the more muddy your tone becomes. So keeping the mic close makes it a lot more punchy and focused in the tone. If you're playing with a live rig, real cab and a microphone, if you're lucky enough that the engineer doesn't just DI you anyway, then you want to keep the mic as close to the grill as you can get to avoid that ambient noise and drive a bit of punch out. Pillar number 3 covers routing for your real world setups. The live routing of your signal matters just as much as the tone shaping. And there's 3 common scenarios. The first one is when you're using your Helix direct to the front of house, so you're not using an amp or a cab on the stage at all. Using this inside your Helix, you would want the full signal chain with the cab block included. Add the high pass and low pass filters as we talked about. And what I also do is I use the global EQ on the Helix to roll off those as well. So on the global EQ, I'm cutting everything at around 40 Hertz. On the cab block, I'm setting it at about 45 to get the cabinet to model some of that bottom end, but I'm cutting it all off at the global EQ anyway. And the same with the high end. I roll that off around 6K on the global EQ, but the cab, I want the cab to behave like it's rolling off at 5K. And also make sure that you're setting your Helix output to be mic level, not line level, to get the optimal tone and sound coming out of your Helix. The second most common one, which I often use myself in smaller venues, is your Helix to the front of house, but also then a real cab and amp on stage for stage monitoring or a bit of stage sound. In these cases, you want to split the signal path with a send just before the cabinet. So it'd be amp, send, cabinet. If you want to understand more about send and returns and signal paths, then check this video out here and I'll go into more detail about how you set those up. The idea behind this is that we have a full signal, the same as we did in option 1, that goes to the front of house. It includes the cabs and amps and everything else in it. By putting a send in, I can then route a second version of that directly to my amplifier, either through the return or through the input, depending how you want to set that up, without the amp or the cab sim, again, depending on whether you want to include the EQ function of the amp block and just exclude the cab, or you want to exclude both of them, will depend where you put that send. But by putting it there, it means all the signal up until the send will go then out to the amp, and then your stage volume will be as if you'd just gone through effects pedals into your amp and cab, but the front of house is getting the whole modeled sound from you. Make sure you set the levels for those outputs separately. The front of house will want a different volume level or output level going to it than what the front of house is probably looking for. For the send, you want to try and set that to line level and keep the main out going as mic. The third one is in-ear monitors or stage monitors, where you don't have an amp and cab on stage, but you're using something else to give you your sound back. My recommendation for this approach is to use the same system that you're using for the front of house. The full signal goes through. Because your ears can be a bit delicate, depending on the setup you're using for your in-ears, you may want to set a compressor, a slight LA2A compressor at the back end of the chain, just to keep the levels consistent. But I tend to put my compressor at the front of the signal path, and so I don't have that challenge with my configuration. This is the same with your stage monitors. The stage monitor will feed back all of the full signal that you're sending to it as if you were sending to the front of house. And then it's just up to you and the engineer to work out what else you want in the mix and how much of the bass you want in that monitor mix. Make sure you test everything before you play live to make sure that the sound you're getting is exactly what you want. What you should hear in your ears and through the state or through the monitor is what the front of house is getting, but you're not probably going to have the big subs and etc. that go with that. This approach also works for you if you're using an FR speaker on stage instead of your bass rig. Having a look at an example of how I would normally set up a cabinet on a Helix preset. This is a very simple preset. I've got a compressor at the beginning. It then compresses the tone so that I've got no outlanding highs and lows in my playing. I've just got an SVT4 Pro configured, and I've got a single 8x10 SVT. As you can see here, I've got a 421 dynamic mic. So for live playing, my recommendation is either between the 421 or the 57 dynamic. The main difference that I hear between the two of them is the 57 is a little bit brighter and the 421 is a little bit more rounded or a bit more warm. If you're at a gig and this is going a bit pear-shaped on the bottom end side, then maybe swapping between the 421 and the 57 might just be enough to fix that bit of bottom end boom that you've got going on. I also have that on the cap edge. I find that the cap edge gives me a bit of the attack, but also a little bit more of the speaker cone sound. So it's not the full cone sound. So I like this as my sweet spot, but play around with moving that to yours. But again, if you're getting that too much woofiness or bottom end low mud, moving the mic in towards the cone more should help that out a little bit as well. As I described before, I keep the distance at 1. That's the lowest I can get on the Helix. It's effectively on the grill. The angle will give you a different tone, but it's not necessarily going to be a major impact to the challenges we're talking about at the moment. The next two are the ones that are the primary. So apart from mic placement and mic choice, it's that low cut and high cut. So you can see here I've got it low cut at 45 and a high cut at 5. So if you look at the specs, this cabinet rolls off at around 5 kilohertz. So anything above 5 kilohertz for this cabinet is largely irrelevant noise. And while I could cut this at 60 hertz to get rid of all the bottom end, I want to keep some of the lows in there. So I find between 45 and 50 is a good balance between getting rid of the sub lows and keeping out of the way of the drum while keeping some bottom end. So with these low cut and high cut, it sounds a bit like this. Nice and warm, fat, sounds good. Now, if I take the low cut off and the high cut off, then this is what I'm going to get. It might not sound it to you, especially if you listen to this on your iPhone, but there's a lot of bottom end noise that's coming in, and I'm getting a little bit more of the string sound coming through. Well, that's what I can hear being this close to the sound. So again, if I just add that back in, it just tightens the tone up a little bit, makes that not as warbly. And then just to see the difference, if I go from the 421 to a 57, here it's a little bit brighter. So again, if you like that 421 sound, but it's a little bit muddy when you're live, just swapping it to the 57 might just give you enough of that cut in those lower mids that you need to stop being woofy. Now, if we look at the alternate pathing we talked about before, we have a cabinet on stage, what I'd probably do is pick a spot and I would add a send. And that send is then just going to go out through the send, and I would then connect that through to my amp, which will then drive it. Again, this position here means I want the tone controls of the SVT, but I don't want to send the cabinet simulation. If I move it in front of the cab, I'm going to send to the amp just the compressed signal, no other noise, and then the front of house will get the amp and the cab. So again, depending on how you want to play around, if you're getting lots and lots of bad sounds on stage with your amp and cabinet, then move that send in front of the amp and bypass it completely. The front of house will get exactly the tone that you want, so the audience will hear exactly what you want them to hear, assuming the engineer doesn't then go and stuff it up with other things at the desk. But I found that they don't tend to, as long as they're not getting a hum or a bad sound, they're just going to blend in from a volume perspective largely. So again, play around with that. You may want to move that in front of the amp and bypass those controls altogether. Before each gig, make sure you play the patch at real stage volume through the PA or the monitor that you're going to be using. Listen from the front of house position. If you've got a wireless, then you can walk out to the front of house position, unless you're in a major stadium, and then that's a different conversation we should be having. But if you're in a relatively small gig, then walk out to the front of house position and listen to that, or send someone else out there to listen to how it's going and give advice on what needs to change. Feel confident enough to adjust the EQ and the output levels on site. Being able to turn the knob to turn the volume down or the output level down, or to adjust the EQ on your Helix while you're on site to adjust for the room acoustics is an important skill to have. So don't be scared of doing that. If you're worried about it, create a second copy of the patch, play around with that while you're at the venue, and then maybe save it as the venue's name in case you want to come back to it later. Once you've set your tone at the venue, when you get home, A/B that compared to what you had it at when you were listening at home, and see how much different it is and if there is much difference. Again, my live rig setup is the same that I use at home. So for me, bring the HX Stomp to the studio, to a live venue, to a home recording, or for just practicing, to me it's consistent. The only thing I change is output volumes depending on the bass that I'm using or the configuration I'm playing for that particular patch. I try and keep it consistent. And I found that the live tone setting works at home, whereas not always the other way around. Getting a solid live bass tone isn't about magic, it's about using your tools wisely. Low cut, high cut, smart mic choices and placement, and dialing your tone in at the volume you'll actually play will make a significant difference to the output and the quality of tone you're getting. There's challenges with the Fletcher-Munson curve. There's bodies in the room, there's echoing around the room, there's a whole bunch of mechanics that come into play when you move from your controlled or semi-controlled bedroom or your headphones to a live gig. So using these tools will help you with controlling what you can control and making the tone consistent. By setting it up for a live rig, I've found that that live setting also translates well when I'm at home in the headphones. Do I have that whole bottom end that I used to have? Probably not, but I didn't really need it anyway. And when I start putting drums or guitars or other things into the mix when I'm playing back or practicing, or I'm recording something for my new hit record. Have you checked out Reckless Empire? They're on Spotify. Then I don't really notice the difference. So my preference is to set it up for live at volume. The high cut and the high pass are probably the most critical things you can look at. And don't forget to check out the global EQ on your Helix. It's also an underrated element that you should consider setting up. So what's your live rig setup, and what's the biggest tone struggle that you're getting when you play live? If this video helps to get you across a challenge you're currently having with your rig, please like and subscribe to the channel for some more tips, and check this video out next. Catch ya.